with all the emails we send, inclusive, reply all, the yes, I'll see you in a minute, all those kind of emails, there are 12,000 times from Earth to the moon with a car on carbon emission. That's huge.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Environment Variables, the podcast where we bring you the latest news and updates from the world of sustainable software development. I'm your host, Chris Adams. When we talk about green software, we often talk about optimizing code we already have, or finding out ways to make the energy we use less carbon intensive. So for the computation we do end up using, we end up with less pollution in the form of greenhouse gases and so on being emitted as a byproduct of our work. However, there's another way to look at this. If we accept that the most efficient database query possible is one that you don't have to make because you've designed a system not to need them, then you can argue that the most efficient system can be one that you haven't had to spend loads of time, energy, and money building an entirely custom version of, because you found an existing set of components that work well together. This is essentially the argument made when people make the case that a technology stack containing open source software can be more sustainable than a closed source one, in that the cost gone into building the various components is shared across all the millions of people who would otherwise be duplicating all this effort building their own versions of these open source the components. But does this apply elsewhere as well, though? Low-code and no-code environments have grown in popularity over the last few years, and one argument in favor of using them is that by building the system, or building any system from a set of existing components offered in a kind of visual, low-coding environment, you avoid the need to spend so much time, money, and yes, energy building your own custom software in the first place. This brings up all kinds of interesting questions. Does this just mean that we end up with more software in total because more people are building their own software rather than a relatively small number of professional developers? And are the needs of organizations so sufficiently generic that you can use low-code environments for this kind of stuff to avoid needing all that custom code? And if you're stuck using providers who are moving slowly to transition from fossil fuel in their infrastructure, what are your options? With me to explore these ideas today is Marjolein Pordon, one of the few people I've seen talking about both sustainability and low-code at the same time. Thanks for joining me today, Marjolein.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Okay, you're welcome, Marjolein. Can I give you a few minutes to introduce yourself and what you do? And because you're the first Marjolein I've ever met, if I'm mispronouncing your name, could you please just share the pronunciation so I can use it properly when I'm later on the call? Because I'm trying my best, but you're the first Marjolein I've ever met.
Marjolein is a Dutch name, and you're pronouncing it correct. It's like Mar, and then Yo from the rapper, Yo-Yo, and then a line, like a thin line. So Marjolein, that's completely correct. Well, I'm Marjolein Pordon. I'm 38 years old. I live in the Netherlands, and I'm a quality consultant for the company Praegus. Praegus is a test consultancy company, and we also have a branch that looks into low-code. And one of our CEOs is very much into sustainability. So I'm really in my place there. She also thinks that we should move to an office with sunlight energy and wind energy. So it's not just me, but also in the company I work for that we have these standards. And I'm now, I think, 8 years in the business. And I really love working in IT, testing, and things like that. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here. Oh, and within low-code, I've had a few assignments in low-code, and it got me the nickname Lady Low-Code because I'm so passionate about low-code and talking on conferences about it.
I'm glad you mentioned that, actually. First, for the breakdown of Marjolein, that's very easy to understand, but also having an alter ego like Batman is also very interesting and useful to have. And makes it really easy to find you as well for the website. That was one way that we came across you, actually. So, and you mentioned a couple of things that were quite interesting there. So, let me just quickly introduce myself for people who've never listened to this before. So my name is Chris Adams. I am the Executive Director of the Green Web Foundation. It's a Dutch-based non-profit focusing on a fossil-free internet by 2030. I also work as one of the policy chairs for the Green Software Foundation's policy working group, where we basically do work at that intersection of policy and green software. If you are new to this podcast, folks, we will share a transcript of everything, and we mention quite a few projects, and we'll be listing those in show notes. So we'll share links to that at the end of that. So if you're listening and there's something that caught your eye, please do take a look out for that, because that's one thing that we have available. Finally, okay, back to the podcast. Marjolein, I think you're sitting comfortably?
Yeah, I am.
Excellent. Okay, so you mentioned that you didn't always work at this intersection, and you worked in a couple of fields where you might specialize in this niche. And you said that they've kind of influenced your thinking today. Like, could you maybe elaborate on some of that? Because you spoke about, say, testing and stuff like that. And we know that some of the tools people use for testing end up being the same tools you might use for driving certain activities, driving a browser and stuff like that. So yeah, maybe if I just give you a bit of space to expand on that, then that might help listeners understand some of the connections here or how you got here.
Yeah, I started as a software tester in 2017. My boyfriend is also a software tester, and he said, you would be perfect for it. I started on high code, traditional projects, worked there for, I think, a year or two. And then in 2019, I was available for a new assignment. And I get really obnoxious then because I don't like doing nothing. So then a coworker said, well, you can fill in for a week and a half. It's low code, it's easy, just do your thing. And then it seemed to be not so easy because low code platforms have standards. You need to use them as required. And people didn't do that. So instead of a week and a half, I was there for a year and a half.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and then I noticed that if you use low code well, the reusable components make the time to market quicker, but also your energy use lower. And the platform that I was working on then also now doesn't refer to itself as a low code platform, but a sustainability platform, because they say even more important than a quick time to market is that we even can go to market. Because in the Netherlands, we see that the energy use is that high that companies are not allowed to be connected to the energy network. So that local platform said we need to change our way of working, because if we do not do that, we cannot make new apps, because there's simply not the energy to do that. Will be cut down. So we need to do something. And if other companies don't, then that's up to them. But we make the change because we see that it's necessary for the environment. And I really like that. So I got passionate about low code on the one side, and sustainability became a thing. And then in 2022, I was asked for QA and test to speak there on Green IT. And then I got in contact with professors in Spain and in Portugal, not only on sustainable green IT, but also on the connection with low code. And well, it got me convinced that we really need to do something, because it's scary how much energy resources we use, but also hardware resources we use. Because if we make quicker apps, heavier apps, we need new hardware, but we are losing also those resources. So we need to change our way of thinking, and low code, I think, is a good way to help us change the way we feel and think about software development.
Okay, that's actually, so you said a couple of quite interesting things that I haven't heard people mention before. One of the first things you spoke about was this idea that, okay, given the fact that there are limits that we need to stay inside, the thing we need to do is actually, if we're going to increase the kind of utility of the services we need to do, then we need to make them more efficient. So we did a couple of episodes ago, we did one all about multi-tenancy, about the idea of like multiple people sharing the same platform and using it in a more kind of efficient way, rather than having the equivalent number of like multiple separate platforms which aren't used very much. And it seems like you're touching on some of those ideas there, because this is actually the first time I've heard groups actually take the kind of limit thing quite seriously, because you often see folks talking about, okay, well, we're going to make things more efficient. But if you look at the large providers, say Amazon, Google, and Microsoft, all of these providers seem to have plans to massively increase the energy use they're using. So this is actually quite a different approach that you've been laying out here. It's like, well, actually, we're going to use the efficiency to kind of book those savings rather than just use it to sell more stuff, basically. Okay. And that was actually quite cool. And the thing that you also mentioned as well was this idea about the testing aspects. Now, I think that there was a term that we spoke about before in the kind of preparation session for this. You mentioned this idea of like shifting left. So there are things that you would do when you're a tester to make sure you can meet a set of standards. And it seems like there's maybe some ideas about applying those things as part of a kind of process so that you kind of maintain a certain level of efficiency or a certain level of accessibility or sustainability as well. Maybe we could just expand on that, a little bit of that before we move to the next point.
Yeah, because if we look to testing, usually we come at the end of the development cycle. The things are made and then we test it and then we say, well, we trust this to work or we not, and then it needs some rework. But what we believe as test consultants is the earlier we are connected, then we can think ahead. We can look to the requirements. And not only about the product, but also about the sustainability. Because if we create awareness with the developer how to make his application more energy efficient, it's better be done before he starts building. Same with the product owners and the designers and the architects. They are the ones that should design the system to be energy efficient. And if we all work together, and if I as a tester know what they have done, then I can also check that. And it's going to be important because, at least in Europe, we have the ESG legislation. And what I hear a lot is that small companies say, oh yes, but it's only for the big companies. Is it? Because if you supply to a big company, you're part of the chain.
Yeah.
And you need to also document and let know that you are efficient. And it could be that you lose some big clients because you do not have the things that they need for the legislation.
So they can report. Yeah, I see.
So in the whole chain, we need to shift left. We need to use sustainability as a non-functional. And it works broader than just environmental sustainability. Because on the marketing part, we all know that especially the youth want a better world. If you want those as your clients and they're going to grow up, they're going to work in companies, then you need to be green. Then you need to show that you care for the world. So it's not just that you save the planet, but you also save your brand, you save the way people look at you, and you make sure that you are there in a few years.
I see. Okay. So you're referring to like essentially retaining talent and actually attracting people who are basically looking around and thinking, hey, we should probably be doing something on this climate thing. And if a company is not kind of living those values, that's going to make them think twice about even, should I join this organization? Should I choose to work in this field and so on? Okay. Thanks, Marjolein. Okay, so we've spoken about low code and no code, and you mentioned that there's you're working for one provider. Maybe it might help to just get a bit concrete because it's quite a wide-ranging term. So when we talk about things like, say, low code, maybe we could talk about some of the kind of better known services so people get an idea of what they might look for. So what is like a low code system in this case, or who are the companies that do this kind of stuff perhaps? If you could talk about that, and then maybe we might see if there's any open source equivalents that might be useful for developers who are listening or people who might want to take some of their steps into this field.
Yeah, I'm not connected to a particular platform. I have worked, I think, with 5 platforms, but as an independent tester. What we see is you have different kinds of low code. So some are in the workflow management. You have CRM systems, web pages, ERP systems, all based on reusable code. And those can be modular. So like Mendix likes to call drag and drop. I have a component, I drag it and put it in. WordPress works the same way, but then you build a website. Those like workflow and Aden, I think, is a one. And Zapier And for CRM, you have Creatio. And all that I mentioned are open source tooling. And I think that's important because, like you said, if you share that knowledge and share that code, people don't have to make it their own, and they don't have to invent the wheel again. That's, I think, important because you don't have to know everything. You need to know where to get it. But also the energy efficiency and the environmental impact is way lower if we reuse code.
Okay, thank you for that. So to reiterate, so when we're talking about low code and no code, we might be talking about, so you mentioned a few platforms that people may have heard of. So one is Zapier, which is very, very common, that will basically plug into an existing software as a service and then let you make a transform. And there was another one you mentioned, which was N8N, which is a little bit like a kind of open source like equivalent. I'm not sure if they're technically using an open source, it's more like source available, but the general idea is you can run it on your own servers so that you can have a similar idea of pulling information from one place and having little bits of JavaScript or something like that you run there, with the idea being that you have multi-tenancy, lots of people using the same things, because you need a little bit of code rather than having a whole running one. And you also mentioned Mendix, which was a more visual option. And some of them which are more specifically tied to an existing, say, enterprise system or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so we spoke a little bit about, in the intro, some of the arguments people use about where low code might fit into this kind of into this world of green software and reducing the total resource requirements of anything like this. And we've spoken about the idea of lots and lots of people using, say, shared components in a centralized service. Now, this implies that lots of companies have problems which are similar enough to each other that you can actually solve something like this. And when I've spoken to people in various organizations, they often, a common kind of theme is, our stuff is so unique that the only way we could possibly do this is by hiring a really, really expensive specialized developer, because only they could possibly capture the uniqueness of our organization. And this seems to suggest that's not the case. Maybe we could talk a little bit about that. Like, is it that companies are over-indexing on how unique they are, or where does this fit in? Or are there some parts that you can do, but there's still places where you might need a specialist, for example? Maybe you could kind of share a little bit about that, actually.
Yeah, well, it might not be a popular opinion, but I feel that companies need to convince themselves they're unique, because how else are they going to stand out? And what I see with companies that embrace low code is that they say, well, we choose to look for the components we have in common with other companies. And if we build those components, those modules, those parts that we need in low code, we have time left, we have money left, we have expertise left to build those few things that are customized. So we all know software projects takes ages, deadlines are never met. But what if we use those components that are alike? Because every company has parts that align. If I sell something, I need a cash register, I need a website, all those things align. And if I need a small part that's not aligned, that I want different from my competitors, then I can let that build by that said expensive developer. But that developer only has to do that little part for maybe a week or 2 weeks. And the rest is built in low code, it's energy efficient, I save money, I save time. And I invest for just those parts that I really want to stand out in. And it can also mean that you think that you're just alike everything and you build everything in low code, and what you save in money you can add to invest in your company, add new products, do your marketing. So the low code embracers, I feel, say, yes, we are unique, but we use what we have in common to do in low code, and what we do not have in common and stand out, we invest in that.
Okay, I can follow that argument now, actually. And there's maybe one question I have for you is basically how these platforms are built, because usually Like rather than paying to have an entire server or something like that, you might pay for kind of per use. And this is like an argument people make with serverless computing is like, if you're paying for the requests or you're just paying for the amount of computation on a kind of per second basis, then you have an incentive to reduce the amount of computation you're using, and because you have it linked there's a much clearer incentive for you to do this. Is this common? Is it fairly common for, say, low coding tools to bill for like provide granular billing in terms of like a request made or a kind of run or a workflow? Like what are the units that people tend to use when they're looking at something like that?
The bigger platforms I notice have trouble or are not quite there yet to do that, but there are smaller platforms who say, well, this is the way we do it. And I think that's creating of awareness. What does my system do? Because I pay for it. And we all know money is a big incentive to say, oh, wow, why am I doing this? And when I did my talk in 2022, I did some research. And what I noticed is what we do in social media every day. And I had a thing that if the miles from Earth to the moon, with all the emails we send, inclusive, reply all, the yes, I'll see you in a minute, all those kind of emails, there are 12,000 times from Earth to the moon with a car on carbon emission. That's huge. Every single day by every mails we send and that are sent, 12,000 times, so 6,000 times to the moon and back again. Every single day. That's huge. When I knew that, I was going through my newsletters. Which one am I reading? Actually reading. Not reading. Sorry, I unsubscribe. And that's only maybe 100 emails in the year, but still it's 100 less. So that was for me an eye-opener. But if I had a bill every month of 100 euros because of emails that were polluting and that I wasn't even reading or even opening,
then you're going to think about that, yeah.
Then the awareness would be even bigger. So I think that's it. Yeah, so I think that the platforms that are doing that billing are really good because that's the best way for awareness.
Okay, all right. Thank you for that. That makes sense. And there are a few cases that, a few of them that I do believe expose some of these metrics to you like that. At climateaction.tech, one of the communities I run, we use N8N that provides some of this for some of these things. And I've seen similar things with windmill.dev, which also gives some of these, exposes some of these numbers. So we spoke a little bit about the efficiency part, but there's also one thing that came up is, okay, if you're using one platform, for example, there'll be things that you cannot change because they are kind of with the provider's decision. For example, if you're, like one example I can think of is there's a service called Webflow. This is a kind of low-code tool for designing websites. And they run on AWS, who for the last few years have been less ambitious on climate in terms of greening their own supply than, say, Microsoft or Google, based on like the things that we see in the public domain, for example. And I know there was one example, there was a project called Flow TY by a chap called Farshad Irani. One thing he basically did was he looked at where you could do this. And because the thing that gets built is maybe a static website that's created by Webflow, he was like, well, if you've got this, maybe you can move this to a greener provider, for example, or maybe you can apply some kind of digital sustainability techniques to reduce the size of the page and do things like that, right? Now, this was one example of like a low-code service, which was like if you're going through maybe Webflow, for example, you're tied to kind of infrastructure where the people providing that are not as ambitious as some other groups, for example. So you're kind of stuck there. But there are cases where there are options. So you can say, well, I like what you're using, but can you move to another provider? Or if you don't do this, then I will move to another provider themselves. Maybe you could talk a little bit about like what your options are if you are using some of these tools, because one of the things I've heard people say about no-code or low-coding tools is like, yeah, they're great, but now I'm stuck inside this specific environment where I have no other way of moving away from that. Maybe you could touch on what are your options if you do want to ask your provider to improve the sustainability further down in the stack, for example.
Well, what I noticed is one of the big platforms, Mendix, has made it a big issue. And that's because a lot of their clients pushed them. And then the majority counts. Then they need to do it because they don't want big clients to walk away. Again, they are part of the chain of big companies. So the ESG legislation is probably also hunting them, which is good. But yeah, vendor locking is a big issue in low-code because, for example, I have an application built in Java, C#, whatever. The developer that I have or the service that I use or the company that I use, I don't like, we have issues, we part. Then I just hire another Java developer. But if I do not like the platform, same with if I wouldn't like Excel or if I wouldn't like Word, everything that I did in there, I need to migrate. And it's not easy. I mean, I could open things in Google Docs if I went from Word to Google Docs, but still I could have issues with the outline, with the layout, things like that. So migrating from one platform to another is not easy. And the integration with platforms, like if I had used one platform and then I think, no, I don't want it, but the application can stay there, but I built something new in another platform, the connection is really hard. Because I always say Lego wants you to use Lego and not Knex. So, and maybe you can connect Knex to Lego, but it won't be easy. It won't be good on usability. So yeah, the vendor locking is definitely a thing. So before you start with a local platform, wherever you need it for, do your research, search on, is this the platform I want now and in the future? And not only on, does it work for my company, but also what legislations are coming? Are they sustainable? What is my client group wanting? Things like that.
Okay, so there's not just, so there's almost like a case about alignment you need to be checking for, but also kind of influence you might have as well as actually just saying, is this really convenient for me right now, for example? Okay, all right. Yeah. That's actually quite helpful. The one thing I can share with you when I was looking through this that the listeners might find interesting, especially if they are developers, we've come across some tools which are open source. They provide kind of low-code-like environments, but they also allow you to kind of drop down into your preferred programming language. One thing I've really been quite impressed with is one project called windmill.dev. So it's an open source kind of low-code platform. Well, it's more like it's a platform where you have visual ways of working, but there's also a way that you can drop into pretty much your own language or use any kind of Docker container. And that, because the actual platform itself is open, that's one thing, but also the fact that you can drop down into languages that maybe developers might be familiar with means that that reduces some of the lock-in to an extent. And I think that's actually quite a promising path to go down because, yeah, you have that separation that we know in other kind of sectors. Having separation at different layers does allow for you to have more options on the table. Okay, so can I just come back to one thing that you spoke about before? Because I was really surprised and actually quite impressed by the whole thing about saying, well, okay, we're going to use this as a absolute limit in energy we can use. So the only way we can do this is by increasing, if we want to grow, then we need to make more efficient use of this rather than just say, we're just going to keep growing as fast as we can and we're not already going to think about the resource requirements. So we spoke about this idea of, and this is one thing, an ongoing discussion in green software, which is about basically growth and the idea of the rebound effect. Are you familiar? There's a term called the rebound effect, which basically refers to this idea that if you make something more efficient, you can increase the total usage of this just because it's become more accessible to more people. And one of the key things around tools like low code is that, yes, you're democratizing access to computation, but it also increases the number of people who might be making systems as well, which can have some similar effects. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the conversation and how you're seeing that evolve in the Netherlands specifically, because that's somewhere where you have seen, like you mentioned, a moratorium on new data centers being built, which has meant that it's forced some of the conversations that are probably not happening quite so quickly in other parts of the world. And this was, you brought this up at the beginning of the podcast. It feels like it might be worth just spending a bit more time looking into that.
Yeah, because if you look at data centers, we have, I think, 3 big ones in the Netherlands. And the one, I think, in Lelystad uses as much energy as the whole of Amsterdam. That's huge. One data center takes up the same amount of energy as the main city of our country. And that's crazy if you think about it, because we cannot build the houses we need at the moment because of the nitro legislation, but because there's not energy, there's not enough water, and those data centers use water and energy of a complete city. So if we do not have that data center in the Netherlands, then we could build a complete city of Amsterdam. Think of all the houses we could build. So this is quite a discussion in the Netherlands. Arjen Lubach is a guy who is a television presenter, and he makes those kind of reports on this. So also to make us aware, because they are built for a part with our money from the taxpayers. So we are aware that it gives jobs, a data center, we need it, and that it's good for Google and AWS to be here, but they're not energy efficient. And, well, one of the politicians said, we need them to give back, because they're here in the Netherlands, they pay for the energy and for the water, but they need to give something back also for sustainability. And what we now are looking into is that they heat water to cool down their data centers, but we could use that water to heat cities with city heating. So then they should make sure that there are pipelines to the city next to the data center, and then the warm water from the data center can flow through the houses and heat them. And then when the water is cooled down, it can go back to the data center, and then you have the rebound effect, and you can reuse the hot water to heat the houses, and the cool water can go back to the data centers. And data centers says, no, that costs too much money. And we are in the Netherlands now working on a legislation that will make sure they have to do that. If you want a data center in the Netherlands, then you need to build it. And you need to build the system to heat houses. And I think that's good, because then you're cooperating, then you're working together and making sure that we need the data centers, but they can give back and work together so that we can still have a better environment. Because if we go on like this, they had, I think, requirements for 2030 in the Netherlands. Well, we're not going to meet them. And then they said, well, no, but we'll make them in 2040. Yeah, and in 2030, you'll say 2050. We need to do something now. And I think that by making this happen, saying to a big company like Google, fine, you have your data center, but these are the requirements, or else. It's just necessary to do this.
Okay, that's a very different take that we've seen in other parts of the world when discussing this, actually. And what we can do is we can share some links to some of those points, because I haven't heard those stats and those numbers presented in that way before, actually. Marjolein, I just want to check up. So we've covered quite a lot of ground. We spoke about like low code and things like that. If people do want to, if they found some of this interesting and they are looking to take some of their first steps into low code, into this field, could you maybe just like suggest a few places where people should be looking to either learn in their own time with some training, or if there are any particular projects that you would want to draw people's attention to for this?
Well, for the low-code part, most applications have their own playground and learning environments, which are quite good. So I would start there on the low-code part. There are not many general courses on low-code, but I'll check them after we're done with the podcast, and then we'll add them to the show links.
And if there was maybe one platform people might work with or start with, or is there one that you would suggest people take some of their first steps with, for example, or something like that? If they're coming it to begin with, they just want to start kind of kicking the tires or trying it out, for example.
Well, I would start with like a Mendix or an OutSystems or things like that, where you have a lot of information and a community behind, so that you get the hang of what is low code, what are the standards that you need to work with. And if you have done like 1 or 2 of those, then you see the common ground, and then the other platforms will be a lot easier.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, Marjolein, thank you very much for that. If we're just coming to the end of our time now, so if people have found this interesting and they want to follow what you're doing, where would you suggest people look? Is there a website, or is there maybe where are you online for people to follow your updates and see what you're doing going forward?
Well, follow Lady Lowcode at my tag at Instagram. In Twitter is at Lady Lowcode. LinkedIn is Marjolein Pordon. And my website is www.ladylowcode.com.
Brilliant. Okay, well, Marjolein, thank you so much for making the time to chat with us today. As we mentioned before, we'll run through this to make sure we've got show note links for all the things that we discussed here. And yeah, have a lovely week, all right? Take care, Marjolein.
Thank you, Chris.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show. And of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.